Learning nerds, we did it. Finally, when it comes to this show, an instructional design podcast rankings, this show will always get like the number 2 spot or 3 or 4. It has yet to capture the number 1 spot on an instructional design rankings kind of a list. And that just changed the other day when I heard from FeedSpot that their latest list of the 15 best instructional design podcasts and ours was number 1, which is awesome. This was largely based on your reviews for the show. So whether you've been reviewing this show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other type of a podcast player platform, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to all of you who have been reaching out to me over the years on LinkedIn or Facebook or email saying how much this podcast has helped you for your journey and everything of a sort. Truly, it has been quite the interesting endeavor. It's been a lot of fun. It's been amazing being able to serve you and to try to be able to help the instructional design community more. So once again, a big thank you to all of you who have rated and reviewed this show over the last couple of years. And today, you're in for a really interesting episode. So let's start the show. Hello, learning nerds, and welcome on in to the nerdiest podcast that you're going to hear today. I'm your host. My name is Dr. Luke Hobson. I'm an instructor, author, blogger, podcaster, and of course, an instructional designer. And my purpose is to be able to help you along your instructional design journey. Whether you're a newbie or a veteran, all are welcome on into the show. And of course, you can find all of the resources that I have for you over at drlukehobson.com. For today's episode, I am trying something new. If you have been following me on LinkedIn, you have probably seen that I have launched a new newsletter that is called Confessions of a Learning Nerd. The purpose of this newsletter is to be able to do more with writing, to do more with research, and really dive on in more into different types of stories, insights, and blunders over my instructional design career, and of course, how we can take some of these thoughts and to be able to translate them into how you can really use them. One area that I am really passionate about, and I kind of just like rekindled this passion the other day, has been exploring the history of instructional design. There are so many names of theorists and researchers that we all know, but how much do we really know about either them as people, as researchers, or their work? We recognize the names and the titles, but how many of us have actually gone through the original books and articles and like the presentations from conferences of where these different forms of topics were introduced? And I would wager not many of us. It's something that we just seem to be able to pass on essentially from getting trained as an instructional designer or from you learning about instructional design at your own rate and pace and you are a self-taught instructional designer. But really taking the time to go through the history is really fascinating. So today's episode about the psychomotor domain is an example of this, of taking a deep dive into the weeds, going through the history, and trying to be able to make some connections to modern times. So today's episode is called Why We Don't Talk About the Psychomotor Domain. Does a moment ever hit you when you were like, why have I never thought about this before? Well, one Thanksgiving a few years back, my father-in-law invited a friend to join us for the holiday. He asked me what I did for a living, and I said I was an instructional designer. As I was mentally preparing for the baffled look and the inevitable follow-up question of what on earth is instructional design, I was greeted by an unexpected reaction of, so you developed a curriculum for courses. Wait. What? I mean, like, yeah, my jobs were involved in that, but hey, I'll gladly take the win of someone having even like the slightest clue about our field and what we do. Now, before I knew it, he dashed out the door to his truck and he came back with a stack of papers and he excitedly handed me a syllabus. And then I turned to him and was just like, so what do you do for a living? Well, come to find out, he trains police officers in just about every area you can think of. He was putting together a new course and wanted me to review his syllabus and see what he had done so far. My eyes immediately locked onto his learning objectives because there wasn't just like one or two. I counted about 30. And as I was preparing to launch into my pitch about why it's important to condense learning information and learning objectives into a much more manageable number, something caught me by surprise. I didn't recognize the verbs he selected. There wasn't an identify, explain, or describe in sight. I was staring at verbs like respond, react, adapt, move, and proceed. Even though I had a few years of instructional design under my belt, this had me scratching my head. And I asked, how do you measure these objectives? And he said, I have to see them do the movements. Reacting to a threat or being able to physically carry so much gear is a normal part of the process. Of course. I mean, obviously, that makes sense. But where does this fall into Bloom's taxonomy? The thing was, it didn't. Well, in my mind, it didn't, because to me, Bloom's taxonomy specifically meant the cognitive domain. You've probably seen before the image of a pyramid, which shouldn't be a pyramid, by the way, that's a myth, on the lower order to higher order thinking skills. Remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. These are terms I'm sure you are familiar with, but these don't focus on physical movements, on actions, or performances. Creating learning experiences for the military, emergency responders, medical students, dancers, musicians, welders, electricians, or athletes have a different scope entirely, and this is where the psychomotor domain comes into play. But why did an off-chance conversation introduce me to this domain? This seems incredibly important, yet it never came up in my studies. Clearly, I missed something while training to be an instructional designer. Right? Well, yes, no, maybe. To fully unpack this domain, we need to go further, and boy, do I have a few theories. This is the story of the psychomotor domain. In July of 1965, Elizabeth Jane Simpson from the University of Illinois Urbana was the principal investigator tasked with researching and classifying a new domain. From this research came her report called the Classification of Educational Objectives Psychomotor Domain. In this report, Simpson calls out 4 procedural steps. 1. A literature review. 2. Collect an analysis of behavioral objectives for psychomotor domain. 3. Lab analysis of tasks to discover by observation and introspection. And 4. Conferences with scholars knowledgeable in this area. From here, the report dives into the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy and provided 5 purposes for why this taxonomy is important, which is really interesting to be able to hear. And it goes as follows, is to be able to help teachers, administrators, professional specialists, and research workers who deal with curricular and evaluation problems to discuss their problems with greater precision. To facilitate the exchange of information about curriculum developments and evaluation devices, to suggest the kinds of objectives that can be included in a curriculum, to help teachers and others to gain a perspective on the emphasis given to certain perspectives by a particular set of educational plans, and lastly, to help curriculum builders to specify objectives so that it becomes easier to plan learning experiences and prepare evaluation devices. Why am I listing all of these out? Well, for one, how cool is this? I mean, this is our history right here of a research project mapping out why we need to use Bloom's back when it wasn't widely accepted. And 2, I love how our titles have changed, but you can tell these bullet points still capture our work. So with that said, Simpson then goes on and gives credit to the development of the affective domain, the domain pertaining to feelings, emotions, attitudes, values, and beliefs. Something that's not as well known is that this domain was published several years later after the cognitive domain. This came out in 1964, written in their book, Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, Book 2, The Affective Domain. This was 8 years after the cognitive domain was first published. Bloom also didn't work on this alone and co-authored it with David Krathwohl and Bertrand Mazia. With a delay of the research on the second domain meant there was even more of a delay for the psychomotor domain. What's confusing is that the mention of a third domain that was never fully explored. In the book, the authors recognized that a third domain existed, but they didn't feel prepared to create a classification system for it at the time. Their focus remained on completing the taxonomy for the affective domain. So, where does this leave the psychomotor domain? Simpson expanded upon this thought when she attended an AERA conference in 1964 when she heard the presenters say, and I quote, "Although we recognize the existence of this domain, we find so little done about it in secondary schools of colleges that we do not believe the development of a classification of these objectives would be very useful at present. We appreciate comments on this point from teachers and other educational workers who are especially interested in this domain of educational objectives." From this statement, Simpson seemed baffled and mentioned in her report how the psychomotor domain is absolutely relevant in education, such as industrial education, agriculture, home economics, business, music, art, and physical education. Reading this report and these direct quotes does now start to paint the picture of the perceived value of trades and blue-collar jobs. And maybe this is how we got into the misperception that physical labor roles aren't as important as desk jobs. But that's just some speculation, and that might be a story for another day. This is to say then that my question about why we don't pay attention more to this domain is starting to become clearer. From the beginning, it was perceived as less than. Simpson actually supports this by saying her observations led her to believe that there is a hierarchy among the domains. The cognitive domain is considered quote-unquote purer compared to the others. What I found interesting was that another lead researcher for the psychomotor domain, Anita Harrow, went on to say that the affective domain could be seen as the most important. In her paper, The Behavioral Objectives Movement, Its Impact on Physical Education in 1977, she states, "Attitudes and motivation influence a student's self-definition and his impact on others. Therefore, it could logically be stated that before an educator can help a student achieve his ultimate potential in either the cognitive or psychomotor areas, a firm foundation in the affective area must be established." So, there's clearly some hierarchy at play here. Another theory I have is that it's more difficult to assess an ability that doesn't cleanly fall into the cognitive domain. You still have that tinfoil hat nearby, right? Okay, cool. Let's put those on. Okay, great. Let's go in even further. What happens when a learning objective involves all of the domains? I found Simpson's inquiry into this way of thinking to be fascinating. Not every learning objective is going to be simple, clean, and immeasurable with a single domain. For instance, say you are teaching a project management course. One of the learning objectives is to lead a successful and productive meeting. On paper, it sounds simple. But when you give this some thought, this learning objective could fall into each domain like this. The cognitive domain. You need to be able for identifying meeting structures, agendas, and time management, analyzing group dynamics or potential roadblocks, applying decision-making strategies, and problem-solving techniques. Then, in the affective domain, a part of this could be showing respect for diverse viewpoints, encouraging participation, and creating a psychologically safe environment, being open to feedback, and adjusting one's facilitation style. And then for the psychomotor domain, it could be using appropriate body language, operating technology like Zoom, cameras, whiteboards, and then finally managing transitions and turn-taking in real time. In Simpson's report, she mentions the concept of the action pattern domain that encompasses the three other domains. This concept was shared with her by Ray Laurie, professor of educational psychology from the University of Alabama. And somehow I actually found Laurie's book online that went into this concept more. And Laurie believed that the psychomotor domain was a part of a larger domain that he called competency or action pattern domain. And funny enough, the first example that he gave in the book that I swear I did not find ahead of time was on conducting meetings. So him and I are on the same page here about thinking about these different forms of blending of the different types of domains. And once again, if you go and check out the newsletter, you can actually see the images of all these things I'm referencing, by the way, including the screenshot of this chapter of the book. Sadly, this was the end of the trail for action pattern. I could not find any other information about this afterwards. Now, once again, we're looking at a snapshot in time back in 1965, and we have obviously moved the needle further since that period of time. And a timeline from 1965 from Simpson's original report looks like Ravindra H. Dave, often referred to as R.H. Dave, and his work back in 1967 with his presentation in Germany, and then his published work in 1970, introducing the simple 5-level model of imitation, manipulation, precision, articulation, and naturalization. And his work centered around vocational training. From there, we have once again Simpson. 1972 is when she really published her research and created the widely accepted and used hierarchy with levels that describe perception, set, guided response, mechanism, complex overt response, adaptation, and origination. And then we have Anita Harrow in 1972, who developed the psychomotor taxonomy centered on development stages and motor skills, such as reflex movements, basic fundamental movements, perceptual abilities, physical abilities, skilled movements, and non-discursive communication. And once again, in the newsletter, I include a chart and a breakdown of these. If you're hearing me say all these words and you're like, what the heck does that mean? Please feel free to go into the show notes and to be able to look at these more. But essentially, you can kind of think about it from Bloom's taxonomy and now thinking about it as in we have our different types of levels, and there were these different forms of levels pertaining to physical movement, actions, patterns, and things of this nature. Now, here's what I find fascinating about all of this. We have 3 taxonomies for one domain. And from what I can gather, there isn't a clear consensus on which one to use and why. Scholars seem to have their favorites based on personal experiences. And a quick search through scholarly resources about the domain will often spotlight one of the 3 taxonomies, but not all 3. And you can also try this for yourself using a non-academic method like good old Google. And if you try to be able to go and to search for these different types of domains, so like right now, feel free, take out your phone and go and search psychomotor domain on Google. Now, for comparison, go Google the cognitive domain. The sheer difference in the types and depth of resources that appear, it's striking. It is mind-blowing how much more information is out there on the cognitive domain compared to the psychomotor domain. Another observation is that the psychomotor domain hasn't been updated since the 1970s, and it's the only domain that hasn't received an upgrade. The cognitive domain was revised in 2001. You might be very familiar with the newer version of the cognitive domain by Anderson and Krathwohl. And then the affective domain has been linked to the ARCS model approach by Keller and integrated into other learning theories. And while the affective domain itself hasn't received an official update, it has at least been referenced to and used in modern times, so therefore it's still relevant. And then we have the psychomotor domain, alone, in the cold, without a sweater. So if you were like me and left asking, what exactly is this domain, and why have I never heard of it before, here are my final thoughts. One is early fragmentation. After Bloom's group left it undeveloped, the three different researchers, Dave, Simpson, and Harrow, each proposed their own taxonomy. Unlike the cognitive domain, there was no single dominant or official model to build from. People just naturally gravitated to one or the other, and they developed that more from personal preferences or from speaking with others or from different types of research. And then essentially, they just selected one and then kind of went with it. 2 is disciplinary silos. Psychomotor learning often falls under physical education, vocational training, or clinical skills. These areas weren't given priority. They didn't have the mainstream attention, unlike the cognitive domain. It's clear from the research that psychomotor domain was deemed as quote-unquote less than, and I think this notion still holds true today. 3 is the measurement challenges. Cognitive and affective outcomes can often be measured by tests or surveys or reflections. Psychomotor skills require performance-based assessments, which are more complex in nature to standardize and to scale. It doesn't mean it's impossible by any means, but it's certainly more complicated. And then the last point is a lack of integration. While the other domains have stayed relevant and modernized, psychomotor seems to have taken a back seat. Now, to be clear, are there researchers and instructional designers, instructors, and teachers using this domain today? 1,000,000%. There absolutely are. And I actually heard from a bunch of you when I posted the other day about the early research that I was doing for this episode, and a bunch of you commented saying, I'm using this domain right now, and why aren't other people doing this? And it was really interesting. So please know that if you are using the domain right now, you are not alone, but I would say that you are certainly farther ahead than other people. And of course, if you have not heard of a psychomotor domain, and this episode was just cram-packed and full of insights for you to be able to search a whole bunch more information about this episode and about this topic, and maybe you're still feeling a little bit confused, you are also not alone, and because of the fact that the psychomotor domain, in my opinion, has not received the attention that it rightfully deserves. And that, folks, is today's confession from your resident learning nerd. And P.S., if you have been embracing the psychomotor domain and you have public information about this shared somewhere, then please let me know. Please share it with me. I would love to be able to add more examples into the newsletter and to make updates and edits. Folks, if you enjoyed today's episode, tell me. I was going to say, review the podcast. Of course, I always want you to review the podcast. But if you like today's episode and today's style, tell me. Shoot me over a message on LinkedIn or email, luke@drlukehobson.com, and let me know what you think. This one is different. I had to do hours upon hours of research of going through all of these original documentation to be able to find this information. And it was super interesting. I would do this regardless if I had a podcast or not to be able to share this information with you. But if you like this style, which is history, research, a little bit of my weird quirkiness, and trying to be able to tie it in all together to today's day and age, please let me know. I would love your feedback. And of course, if you haven't signed up yet for the newsletter, you can find it on LinkedIn. It was the latest thing that I shared. I also sent out an email about it as well. So feel free to subscribe to the mailing list because you are the very first to hear about my latest and greatest of my random endeavors. And you get a little bit more insight than normal because I can put more inside of an email compared to trying to be able to share something on LinkedIn or on Facebook. And that, my friends, that is all I have for you today. Stay nerdy out there. I'll talk to you next time.